Today's daf yomi is Avodah Zarah daf chaf alpha, Avodah Zarah 21. Today's daf dedicated for Shemir for Chayalim. That's all for the Shvuyim and Yeshua for Am Yisrael. In this eighth Torah, the daf yomi tells us that the Mishnah on the bottom of Chaf Amar Beis, Ein maskirin lahem batim be'eretz Yisrael. You're not allowed to rent to an idolater houses in the land of Israel. And the reason is, says Rashi, because it's a decree, you might come to sell them a house. And if you sell them a house in Israel, that's going to be a violation of giving them a chaniah in the karka, that you're not allowed to give to them, or to chanim. It says the Gemara on yesterday's daf, you're not allowed to give them a chaniah, an encampment in the land. The ain't Sarah Homer, and for sure you're not allowed to give them sados. For sure you're not allowed to rent them fields in the land of Israel. And the Gemara is going to explain what do you mean for sure. The Syria is the part that was called Kibush Yachad. It was conquered by David, and it wasn't conquered by the generation of the wilderness. It was the part that was adjacent to the land of Israel. The Rashi says it was called Aram Sova, and that is next to Israel, but doesn't have the Kedusha, the full Kedusha of Eretz Israel. So therefore, we learn there on top of Chaf from Aleph, the Syria Maskir Lam Batim. You're allowed to rent houses to them of sados, but not fields. Rashi says the reason why you're allowed to rent houses is because we don't decree that if you rent them a house in Syria, you might come to sell them a house. Because even if you came to sell them a house, you would not be violating a biblical prohibition. Because the prohibition of Chaniah is only in Israel. And so therefore you wouldn't be in violation of a biblical prohibition, but you would still be in violation of a rabbinic decree. So therefore, you're not allowed to sell them l'chatchila, because if you sell them in Syria, then you might come to sell them in the land of Israel. Ubechutz la'aretz mocher lam batim, but outside of the land of Israel, there you're allowed to sell them houses, umaskirin sados, and you're allowed to rent them fields. Divrei Rebbe Meir. Rebbe Yossi is going to be one step lenient from Rebbe Meir in all these cases. He says, "Eretz Yisrael maskir lam batim." In Israel, you can't sell them houses, but you can rent them houses. Avolo sados, but you can't rent them fields. In Syria, mochrim batim. In Syria, you can sell houses, umaskirin sados, and you can also rent fields. Ubechutz la'aretz mochrin elu ve'elu. And outside of Israel, you can do both. You can rent houses, sell houses, and rent fields. So b'chutz la'aretz, you could do both. You could sell houses and even fields. And af b'makom, now the Mishnah qualifies this. Af b'makom sha'amru. The reason why I say the Gemara, because this is usually the language of the Gemara, but here we say it in the language of the Mishnah. Af b'makom sha'amru la'haskir. Even those places where we say you're allowed to rent, there's another prohibition. Lo beis dira amru. You're not allowed to rent them for a living there. Meaning to say you're only allowed to rent it for storage. Why can you rent it for living? Because he's avodas kochavim, because it's like we're concerned he's going to take his idolatry into there. You're not allowed to bring your abominable idolatry into your house. And any circumstances, you're not allowed to rent him the bathhouse, because the bathhouse is going to still be called by the Jew's name, and then the person who sees that you're warming up the water on Shabbos, or not that you are, but that the water is being warmed up in the bathhouse, will think that the bath attendants are the messengers of the Jew, and so therefore you're never allowed to rent him your bathhouse. So what's the reason why you're not allowed to rent him your fields? Meaning to say, not only are you not allowed to rent him your fields, but what's the reason why the Mishnah says you can't rent a house in the land of Israel and ain't tzarach or sados, and you don't even need to say that you can't rent a field? What's the reason? If you want to say because there's two prohibitions with respect to renting a field, and if you can't rent a house where there's only one prohibition, but there's two prohibitions for a field, so it's for sure prohibited. One is the reference to you're not allowed to give idolater a place in the land. Chada the kamafko ami meiser, and the second prohibition is that you're excluding it from being able to do the meisers, meaning to say you're not able to give the tithes anymore from the field to the Levites. Well, if that's the case, so if that's the case, hold on 1 second. Hold on 1 second. Just want to look at one thing. Well, if that's the case, Yachi Batim Nami Kutarti, by houses also there's two possible prohibitions. One is Chada Kanias Karaka, one is the that you're giving them a place to live in the land. You're in the house no longer required to have a mezuzah. Amar Mashashia, no, mezuzah chovas hadarhu. You're not excluding it from the mitzvah of the mezuzah because the mezuzah is not an obligation on the house, unlike the meiser, which is the obligation on the field. The mezuzah is an obligation on the one who lives there, and so therefore you're not uprooting anything because it says beischa derech biascha. Only the one who lives there. Rashi says, you're only being warned about the person who's going in and out. That's the mitzvah. And so therefore, mitzvah, the mezuzah is a chovas hadar, and so therefore you're not uprooting anything. The Surya says, the Gemara, the Mishnah, it said in Surya you're allowed to rent the houses, but not the fields. What's the reason that as it relates to houses in Syria, you're not allowed to sell it, but as it relates to what's the reason as it relates to Syria, you're allowed to rent houses, but you're not allowed to sell them? So what's the reason? What's the reason why you can't sell them the houses in Syria? Because Mishum the Mechira Eretz Israel. Because you might come to sell them the houses in Israel. If you sell them in Syria, you might come to sell them the houses in Israel. So we should also prohibit them from renting the houses in Syria, because then you might come to rent the houses in Israel. So the Gemara says, no, he gufa gzera. No, so renting the houses in Israel is a gzera that you might come to sell it. We're not going to make a gzera upon a gzera. So therefore, the whole idea of selling it in the land of Israel is a gzera. So therefore, we're not going to make a gzera upon a gzera. Meaning to say, the whole decree of renting houses in Israel is a gzera. So you're not going to say you can't rent in Syria because you may come to rent in Israel, because that's a decree upon a decree. Gemara says, "V'aschira sada de b'Suria, the gzera gzerahi." But renting the fields in Syria is a decree upon a decree, because if you rent it in Syria, you might come to rent it in Eretz Yisrael, and we do make that decree. So Gemara says, "No, hasam lav gzerahu." No, there with respect to renting a field in Syria, it's not a rabbinic decree. It's not a gzera. But the reason is because Savar Kibush Yachad Shmei Kibush. Rabbi Meir is of the position that the one who conquered the land, i.e., David HaMelech, that was also going to be considered part of the land of Israel. And so therefore, you're biblically prohibited to sell them houses and fields. And even though in Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Meir says that you're not allowed to rent because you might come to sell the houses and the fields. Nevertheless, in Syria, there's a distinction. Sada the Isbei Tarate, by a field that there's two prohibitions, Gazu Bei Rabbanan. Therefore, the rabbis say you can't rent it because you might come to sell it. But Batim, Deleis Beu Tarate, or Gazu Bei Rabbanan. But the houses is only one prohibition, then they didn't make the decree. So we see that even though the Syria is like Eretz Yisrael, nevertheless, it's not completely like it with respect to the decrees of the rabbis. So there are some things that Syria was the same, and some things that it's like Chutz La'aretz. And so therefore, even though it was part of Eretz Yisrael, it wasn't 100% part of Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, the decree was only on the fields, but not on the house. The Chutz La'aretz, and outside of Israel, where Meir says there you're even allowed to sell them houses and rent fields. So Sada the Isbei Tarti Gazru Barabanan, but you can't sell them a field because there's two problems in Eretz Yisrael. Batim the Isbei Tarti But houses where they don't have these two things, there's only one thing, the rabbis did not make the decree, and you could sell the field. Rabbi Yossi Omer Eretz Yisrael Maskir Lam Batim. Rabbi Yossi allows you to rent the houses in Eretz Yisrael, my time, but not the fields. What's the reason why it allows you to rent the houses and not the fields? Sados Tisbu Tarti Gazer Rabban. The rabbis made a decree upon the fields. Batim Delesbu Tarti, but houses where we don't have these things, Lo Gazer Rabban. The rabbis didn't make such a decree. Syria Mochrin. In Syria, you're allowed to sell them houses, according to Rabbi Yossi. In Syria, you're allowed to sell them houses and rent fields. So what's the reasoning? My time out. What's the reason why you're allowed to rent them a field in Syria? Because she says that when David Amel conquered, it's not considered conquering it. And a field which has two things wrong with it, the rabbis made a decree. But the houses, there's only one thing. So therefore, the rabbis didn't make a decree, and so therefore, you're allowed to sell them the house. And outside of Eretz Yisrael, according to Rabbi Yossi, you can sell houses and fields. My time, because it's so far away, we're not going to make a decree against it. The law is like Rabbi Yossi. Amar Rav Yosef, even though the law is like Rabbi Yossi, that chutzlaretz you can sell them houses and fields, as long as we don't make a neighborhood, as long as you don't sell to them so they have a neighborhood. What is that? Tana ein shluna pechusa mishlosha bnei adam. If you have three people, you can't sell to three people because then it's dangerous for you, for the Jews. And so the Gemara says, but why aren't we concerned that one Jew will sell to one idolater and another Jew will sell to two? And then you'll have the three together. So he says, meaning to say, we don't have such a concern. We're concerned about one, but we're concerned that it's going to add up in that direction. Gemara says, and even though those places where they said you're allowed to rent, they don't allow you to rent it for somebody to live there, but only to use it for storage. Miklal the ikaduchta. So it said, from the language of the Mishnah, it says even those places where they allow you to rent, amru, not for living there, do they allow it, but only for storage. Miklal the ikadukta delo mugri. So there are some places where even outside of the land of Israel, they don't allow you to rent. So there must be some places where they don't even allow you to rent. This Stama, Rabbi Meir, and the Mishnah is like Rabbi Meir, who says in Eretz Yisrael, you're not allowed to rent the houses, because it says even those places where they allow you to rent. So it must be there's some places where they don't allow you to rent. Where are those places where they don't allow you to rent? And that must be like Rabbi Meir, who says in Eretz Yisrael, because according to Rabbi Yossi, there's no place where you're not allowed to rent. The Rabbi Yossi, we call Dochtam Mugri. Rabbi Yossi says in every place you're allowed to rent. Well, you're storing, and every place you're not allowed to rent a bathhouse because in the Mishnah, because it's called after the Jew's name. A person is not allowed to rent his bathhouse to the idolaters nation because it's called after his name. So a person is not allowed to rent his bathhouse to an idolater because it's still called by the Jew's name. And this idolater is going to do work on Shabbos and Yom Tif. And so as a result of it, the person who sees it will think that it's the Jew's bathhouse, and he'll think that it is the Jew is violating it, or else he'll think it's permitted. And so therefore, you're not allowed to rent it to the idolater. So the Gemara continues, Avodah Kuti Mai. Avodah Kuti Mai, but according to Kuti, what's the law? Shari, it's permitted. You're allowed to do it to the Kuti because the Kuti is going to be strict and he's not going to use it on Shabbos. But maybe the kuti will do work with it on Chol Moed. Maybe the on Chol Moed the kuti will say it's permitted to do work, and so therefore, since he doesn't follow rabbinic law, he's going to do it. So how come you can rent it to the kuti? Gemara says, "B'chol shemoed anan nami avdina." Well, we're also allowed to do this work on Chol Moed. It's permitted to warm the bathhouses for us on Chol Moed. So the Gemara says, but would you be allowed to rent out your field to the idolater? Shari, it's permitted. According to the to rent out your field to the idolater, that would be permitted. Because since we said in the Brisa that it's prohibited to specifically do a bathhouse to an idolater, the Gemara says a bathhouse is prohibited because you might come to work on Shabbos, but to rent out your field to the idolater would be permitted. Because this is first of all, Rashi says this is only outside of Israel because we're not worried about Chanias Karka. And even though the field is going to be called by his name, there's not going to be chshad that the idolater is his agent. People will say, oh, he's a sharecropper, meaning to say he's working for himself. The idolater is working for himself. And they have an agreement that the Jew gets a certain percentage and the rest goes to the idolater. So the idolater has a responsibility to do the work. So my time, what's the reason? Arisa Rusase Ka'avid. The guy who's a sharecropper, he's got his responsibility to work. Well, if that's the case, Merchatz Namari Arisa Rusase Ka'avid. Well, why don't we say in the bathhouse is doing the amount, like he's contracted for? The Gemara says no. Arisa the Merchatz Lo Avid Inchi. That's not typically the way bathhouse business arrangement is set up. And Tanya Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer Lo Yazkir Adam Sadeh Kusi Nation Nikris Al Shemo. You're not allowed to rent your field to the Kusi because it's called on his name. The Kusi said, the Kuti said, so the Kuti, you can't rent your field to him because then he'll do work on a Chol Moed, and you're not allowed to work your field on Chol Moed. The idolater is permitted because you're going to say that he's doing his sharecropper. Well, if that's the case, why don't we say the same concept by the kuti that he's just working his field like a sharecropper, and it's allowed? So the Gemara says, "Arusas or Rav Shimon ben Elazar Weisley." Well, no, Rav Shimon doesn't agree with it. Rav Shimon Elazar doesn't agree with this concept. He doesn't agree that you are allowed to rent the land to the idolater from the reasoning that he's just doing a sharecropper, because that's not a reason to allow it. So my time, so what's the reason why you can rent a field to your idolater? Because we would tell him that he's not allowed to work the field on Shabbos, and he'll listen to you. And so therefore he's not going to do it, and so therefore there's no concern to rent it to him. Kuti nami amrina levitzayis. A kuti also would tell him not to work the field on Chol Moed. The Gemara says kuti will tzayis. The kuti won't listen. He'll say, I know more than you. If that's the case, so if that's the case, what's the reason why you're not allowed to rent it to the field, to the kusi, because it's called after the Jewish person's name? You should say you're not allowed to rent it because of Lifnei Yiver, because he's going to be working on Chol Moed. It's both reasons. One reason is Mishum Lifnei Yiver, because you're causing him to sin. But because it's called after the Jewish person's name. Okay, this is today's daf. We'll stop here. Baruch Hashem, a beautiful daf, and we'll stop here. Yeshar Koach.